Uh, Hello, everybody. We are back into the lectures on the Middle East in the CEMMIS. It is something that we have started about a year ago, and we are proud to say that we have more than around 10 lectures, if I'm around 7 or 8 lectures now, regarding, of course, the Gaza crisis and the Gaza conflict, but also also other aspects of the Middle East regional politics. Today we have the honor to host Marianna Charountaki, which is a leading expert on Kurdish issues in UK and in Europe. She has worked extensively on Kurds in Iraq and elsewhere, and she is now a senior lecturer at Lincoln University, and also she's teaching in the Erbil University, and also she's very much involved in many academic institutes and institutions in the Iraqi Kurdistan and furthermore. And we all believe that we are now in the midst of a Middle East crisis. We are actually, and the Iran-Israel conflict is and the Gaza slaughtering is on the forefront of the regional politics. But we should not and could not actually forget that the Kurdish issue is one of the major issues in the Middle East, and it is I think the most important issue regarding stability in what we say Greater Mesopotamia, which includes countries like Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So it's we should not forget this issue. So, Marianna. Also, I'm proud for that Marianna was one of my students. I'm old enough to say that I have one of my students as a worldwide expert on international affairs. Okay, Marianna, now is the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for this kind invitation today. I hope you hear me well. I guess this topic does not only have a theoretical, but it also bears empirical importance. I would also like to thank our audience for being present here today, the institution, but also my dear professor. I would prefer if this engagement would take the form of a discussion, given sort of the uncertainty of the current times. Maybe it makes more sense to give a sort of brief overview and maybe invest more time in the Q&As and discussion parts. I would like to start from the general and then move to the specific, and this, I guess, this can facilitate possibly the articulation of my argument in a more sort of constructive way. So here I think we have two important components, the material structures and then the agents. The possibility that current developments lead or can lead to structural changes or at least to shifts in the balance of power, I guess, is one element to consider. And in this sense, this war in Gaza constitutes a landmark on its own right. And this is the case not because of the Palestinian issue, but more importantly, I think it's related to the Gaza conflict and how this is taking sort of intended shape as the fighting reveals from a point, and then the actors, they are found at the heart of this conflict, that is Iran and Israel. And as I mentioned recently into a LSE sort of blog, the central question maybe of this conflict that has changed, and this is also an important, I think, element from an indirect to a dynamic one, is whether it can facilitate the transition from a state's mere survival according to the realist tradition within a hostile environment to a state's pragmatic functioning. And I think this shift can only be evaluated at a political level. It can be solved maybe only through political means. And in the end, I think it concerns both parts involved. Now, at the same time, the developments in this conflict should not be merely understood as an Iranian-Israeli confrontation, but more possibly as part of this international and regional containment of Iran, or an effort to do so in the way that it has been now expanded even further. Now, whether containment contains or remains at the forefront of the international players' foreign policy agendas, I think will determine to a greatest extent any sort of future concrete shifts in Iran's own foreign policy towards international legitimacy. And I do believe that these two elements are somehow interrelated. Now, in specific, the very sort of crisis revealed, I think, the greater role that the Kurds can play through the status of the KRG, more specific. And this, I think, it was witnessed through the series of intense meetings that took place between Iran and the Kurdistan region straight after the outbreak of the crisis in Gaza. Now, before addressing the Kurdish issue, I would like to briefly touch upon the notion of the non-state actorhood in order to be able and understand what we are talking about here, as I perceive it, at least through a typology that I created the year before. Now, referring to the non-state actors is holistically, as sort of as a whole, is a bit tricky, and therefore I try to sort of understand them through several types of entities. And this implies, and maybe when we are referring a bit to the Kurdish case, we can really ground it on the fact that when we are talking about the non-state actorhood, it's not really and truly a new phenomenon, but we are talking about the evolution of the role of these actors, in particular here in Middle Eastern politics. And I think here it needs to be drawn a line, given the fact that undermining the role of non-state actors only to views that perceive them just through the lenses of the state or as mere challenges and so forth, somehow deprives a more sort of in-depth study of this ontological component in international relations that I think it necessitates to be separately understood. That's why I think the understanding of non-state actors as a powerful player in the international scene constitutes maybe the first step towards the need to recognize that their study is subject to review, and such maybe reconsideration brings in interrelated conclusions. So far the literature, more or less, in this Middle Eastern context, has primarily perceived non-state entities as domestic pressures, domestic restraints to the states, focusing extensively on these non-state violent armed actors, an approach from a security studies viewpoint, or they have been also perceived as mere tools for the implementation of foreign policy goals. And this classification that I was basically trying to pursue, it's based on these sort of complexities and perceptions of non-state actors that together, I guess, necessitate a more sort of comprehensive approach to how we categorize them. And in this, very briefly, I try to identify 5 different types. I talked about institutions. Colleagues developed on that 3 examples further. The irregular militaries and militia groups, fundamentalist groups, ethnic groups, and, as I call them, states to be. And this division privileges their nature, since their objectives or modus operandi can be shared. Coming back to the Kurds, we understand that we do not discuss about an issue, but we are talking about different issues based on the context within which each of those Kurdish realities came to be shaped. It means that each Kurdish issue or case has its own sort of characteristics, which of course necessitates its own solutions. And for me, the Gaza conflict opened the door to an increased necessity to identify, beyond anything, the current system. Yes, the current division of the alliances into two camps, roughly, might echoing this Cold War period, which I have also sort of supported this notion, but this is definitely not a Cold War context, and this, I think, it's a shared view. The identification of such context is particularly critical because of the increased role of this actorhood, to the extent that I think the international relations now can be considered a field of interstate, state and non-state, but equally non-state relations. And on this I have extensively written since 2009-10. Having said that, what we actually see is a non-sort of polar world in terms of who is exerting which influence, because this is subject to change based on the case we examine each time. So what we could argue is that the increased sort of number of the actors involved in the shaping of this regional and international politics push us to understand the fact that the role of the actors, such as, for instance, the Kurds here, is interesting part of this current developments, and that no one can be really excluded in this interdependent world. And to specify a little bit more, in the case of Iraq, we can no longer talk about a Kurdish issue. Yes, we talk about problems between Baghdad and Erbil, but the KRG, the Kurdistan region, does represent an example of a constitutionally recognized non-state entity, and among the Kurds, it's the only constitutional example that we have of, I would dare to say, foreign policy making, with an impact on both the regional and international politics. And this foreign policy agency has been reflected in the interactive relations that the Kurdistan region has with its European state actors, the strategic relations with the US, but equally the direct economic agreements with Russia and so forth. For example, I think it's a unique case that since 2015, the KRG is sitting in the same table of negotiations with its own seat within the context of Iraq, and has been represented in parallel with Baghdad in these different institutional meetings that are taking place there. We shouldn't forget, I think, the clear shift from an implicit US Kurdish policy from 2005 onwards to an explicit one from Obama's terms of office onwards, and I think the rise of the Islamic State and the fact that the Kurdish fighters, the Peshmerga, had been an interesting part of this anti-ISIS global coalition, I think has been critical in this sense. So these institutionalized relations in the case of the Kurds in Iraq is exceptional. I'm bringing in the US example because obviously this is the most indicative one. I think if I want to bring another example following the developments of the Kurdistan region's referendum as well, following the night of Kirkuk back in 2017-16 of October, the US stance was indicative of the perpetuation of these institutionalized relations between the two, which was supported through high-level meetings from both sides 7-8 months after the referendum, that somehow it was considered for Kurdish politics a pause. The visit of the US Secretary of State Rick Perry to Erbil was indicative of the US interest in the Kurdistan region, among others, of course, more particularly in the energy sector. Back then, US officials would argue that it is not the US policy to abandon the Kurds or the government in Kurdistan, and that the disputed territories, which is the main sort of apple of discord between the two entities, are still disputed, as there is no an agreement worked out between Baghdad and Erbil on what to do with these territories and who will have jurisdiction over them. So talking about the US relations with the Kurds, so of course these are not being limited to the KRG. It just, I guess, that the relations between the two is epitomized in how really it is about state and non-state interactions. But then equally, when we are seeing the situation with the unilaterally declared autonomous administration in Syria, I'm talking about here the Western sort of Kurdistan, Rojava Kurdistan as it's called, in northeast Syria, we can see there as well that on the ground the US found as the only ally in the battle against ISIS, the Kurds. Now, with regards to the Kurdish issues in Turkey and Iran, I think that the recent reopening of the current peace talks in Turkey, it is an interesting case to follow, and I think it is somehow directly connected to the repercussions that the war in Gaza has been having on regional politics. But at the same time, I guess the situation of the Kurds in Iran is sort of the most silent one. And this is because obviously in the sort of like many past years, there have not been a sort of more informed there development. But of course, it has to do with the general Iranian politics and how things operate in the domestic. I mean, the fact that the 2009 Green Movement was really controlled, I think it's a case in point which demonstrates the situation beyond the Kurdish issue within Iran. I think what we could basically argue is that possibly the current course of events necessitates, I think, its entity to deal with its own affairs separately, as I guess the use of mediators would complicate even further developments. And this, I think, is not only the case with the Kurds, but more broadly with the regional state entities. But overall, if we would like, I think, to assess the impact of the war in Gaza on regional politics, I think it is a case in point that could connote further developments for the Kurdish issues, let's say, in the region, and the extent to which current politics would choose to move collectively. I think we will find the Kurds in the heart of these developments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We're trying to, something is happening with Mr. Russo's mic. Stavros, can you get on it?
I'm trying, but I can't unmute him because he's unmuted, apparently, but he's not.
Yeah, Mr. Russos,
okay.
try.
Okay,
Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for this overview of the Kurdish situation. It's very, very important that you connect it theoretically with the issue of the non-state actors, which is very important. I would use I will exploit my position as, let's say, not a coordinator, but anyhow, because coordinators are Stavros and Sakia, but as an old professor, to ask you a couple of questions that I perhaps you can answer to me. The first is straightforward. What is the relations between the Palestinian issue and the Kurdish issue in the Middle East? And because we have seen in the last years, in the last 10 years or so, a kind of disengagement of the two movements. In the 1980s, 1990s, there was a very close cooperation between various movements from the Kurdish side with the Palestinians, particularly in Lebanon and elsewhere. But generally, ideologically, they were on the same side, on the same page, let's say. Now we are thinking that there is a disengagement between, to say the least, between the two movements, both at least in Rojava and in Iraq, in the Iraqi Kurdistan. Even among the Iranian the Iranian movement, particularly the Arab movement. So what's the relationship between the two movements? Second is that we are talking very much about the model of Rojava. I mean, what is happening there, and there are a lot. A talk, very wide talk, at least among liberal or left-wing circles, particularly in the UK and the United States, about democracy which built from which is in a way homegrown and comes from not coming from upside, but it's coming from the base. What do you think about this idea? Because I'll be frank with you. I think that in all of the Kurdish state or state-like experiments, be it in Iraqi Kurdistan, Kerchi, or in Rojava, there are a lot of, as I say, pre-modern traditional elements which are still dominant.
I'll just start a little bit opposite, Middle Eastern way. I guess I'm not sure if I understood it correctly. We're talking about the mode of governance, and then maybe what sort of mode of governance would work in each of these. I guess
no. There is a question that they are building democracy, at least in Rojava, and are building democracy which is going to be homegrown. It's going to be from the communities and not from above. It's not a system that is created from above.
Yeah, okay. So it's so it's okay. So let me just reflect upon all of this because they are somehow interrelated. First and foremost, when we're talking about, I think these different contexts, we're talking about different frames within which we have different sort of relations among different components. However, I think that the way let's say the Iraqi example has worked, it has demonstrated that when you have different ethnic components that constitute the state, and obviously the state since the city-states until it has been evolved, so there is no such a thing as a sort of particular form. It's more for me, I think, realistic to talk about confederations. In the case of Iraq, the current situation with federalism has shown that gaps that they were pre-existing before the construction of Iraq in 1920s, they are still there only because the systems of governance and, these aspiring to be democratic, these aspiring to sort of being inclusive, have not worked simply because the different regions have different characteristics. On the grounds that these have been demarcated, they are clearly different. And a confederate model, which is independent sort of regions that they work through these democratic processes, but then, you know, somehow they are portraying a unified sort of entity. It seems now, I think, again, in this context of state building, it seems now again to be the main question in Iraq. In Rojava, Kurdistan, in Syria, right now, obviously, we cannot talk about any sort of solutions, any sort of like modeling, simply because the day after in Syria per se has not been sorted out. And I'm sure when it comes to the sort of process, you have obviously, you know, like the Russian involvement, you have the US involvement, but there will be this sort of preference for an inclusion of all Syrians in and out to be sit on the same table on negotiations. The model that we are describing here, that you refer to, of the democratic autonomy, Özgürlük, as it was the sort of important notion that it was coming from the southeast of Turkey, was something that the political representation in the political representation of the Kurds in Turkey were supporting since 2009, even sort of before that. However, if this matters, Öcalan himself, he was stressing particularly this, again, confederate model, and himself was talking about the Kurdish issue and this resolution as the only sort of way through which this sort of democratic peace process in the Middle East could be achieved. And I guess the same applies to the Palestinians in terms of resolution. So we're talking about confederations. And in the case of, but the point is, are the structures in Syria sort of ready to accommodate such a resolution when we have not even reached any sort of point of coming together? I don't think that this democratic autonomy, which what it was supporting, basically, it was supporting, in the case at least of the Kurds in Turkey, that when you have sort of majority in each sort of municipality of, let's say, the Kurds or non-Kurds, then you had the leadership in there. But I'm not sure how this, which does not sound homogeneous, is possible to be applied or understood from the Kurdish population in itself, especially in the southeast, when, for example, you have the gendarme, when you know, they have been in a constant sort of bloodshed for the past like 4 decades. How this as a notion is able to be applicable, but more importantly, B, to be understood from the Kurdish population in itself there. It's not clear what do you, I think, seek for when you're talking about this sort of democratic autonomy. You have, okay, majority in the municipalities and so forth. So what? What this really, where this leads to, and what is aspiring to do? We discussed a bit about the relations between sort of the two movements. I mean, for me, after the Palestinian issue, the Kurdistan is one of the most important in the Middle East, simply because through its resolution, as yes, you mentioned, at least peace, it could be possible to be achieved, because this means that you are accommodated differences in a sort of political way, through political means. The relations are not necessary. I think, apart from, obviously, there is a sort of consulate of the PLO in Erbil right now. There is representation, and so which means that there are relations, but the extent, you know, to which these relations are developed or not, I think is subject to. It's subject to change. I'm sure the Kurdish presidency, it has, when the war in Gaza, I think, broke out, straight away the Kurdish presidency came with a sort of like speech supporting the Palestinians and how it's, you know, it's their own right to have their own state, and all this. So obviously there is a direct support, and there was a direct support vis-a-vis their cause, but politically, I'm not sure. I mean, of course, having good relations is a good thing, but I'm not sure the extent to which this could have particularly sort of, you know, particular impact on the development of the situation in each of these cases. And the same applies, I guess, maybe to a lesser extent in the case of the other sort of co-national Kurds as well. I mean, I think the realities have shaped structures that you have to work within in order to be able and reach certain outcomes. And I think since this reset policy that, you know, Obama brought in and all these sort of divisions in the years administration that created thereafter, I think, and sort of inverted commas disengagement, I think it demonstrated that the different entities in the Middle East are left to manage their own affairs. And now I think that the only way forward, that's why before I mentioned about this non-mediation and so forth, I think the only way forward is how separately all these different components in each of these sort of settings we're talking about are able to sit together on the table of negotiations, discuss and find solutions. Otherwise, I don't think it's possible any sort of viable solution to be found in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. So we have a question from the audience, but you basically answered it already. So we're going to skip it so far because it's about self-determination and democratic restructuring. So you already answered. So my question is with regard to Israel and the Kurds. During the 1950s up until the 1970s, Israel's periphery doctrine was based on bridging relations with communities in potentially enemy states in the Middle East, in order to have some sort of relationship that could influence what's going on in the foreign policy of, say, Syria or Iraq towards Israel. So what I would like to ask is whether you see these relations that we're building during 20 and 30 years, if there is something left in current Kurdish and Israeli relations, whether we're talking of the Kurds of Iraq or the Kurds of Syria. Of course, we're not talking about the Kurds of Turkey because Israel was adamant on not cultivating any relations with the Kurds of Turkey due to the PKK and trying to cultivate its relationship with Turkey throughout the 20th century. So are the actions of the attempts of Israel during the Cold War, let's say, have any reflection today on current potential relations?
All right, so you placed many questions. I would be a little bit challenging, even though I don't want to. I'm just going back a little bit very briefly about this sort of democratic restructuring and so on. I'm not sure how really we need to describe it. I'm not sure what democratic restructuring means, but obviously there are elections in place, at least in Iraq. It's interesting that today maybe we're talking about, in inverted commas, the only constitutionally functioning to some extent entity in the heart of the Middle East, if we see the Middle East very strictly. So it means something, this. So I guess reaching through political dialogue solutions is what maybe this democratic surveillance is related to. Other than that, we understand that in the Middle East we talk about, or for instance here in Iraq in particular, we're talking about tribal societies, and this element is something that it cannot be ignored. And I guess this sort of like increase of the actors, not only like, you know, sort of like horizontally, but also vertically in each of these states we are talking about, it is a bit dramatic, because sometimes this means that you have to talk with more than one interlocutors, which creates huge problems because the state is not being represented by one. For example, now if you go to Baghdad, maybe you need to talk with 20 and 30 political representatives, that they do play a different but important role rather than with one. So it's by itself, I think this, this bears a difference. Now, with regards to the Israeli and Kurdish relations, I think we have to be a bit honest here and not just stick to sort of like maybe stereotypes or images or what it's sort of sometimes convenient to be portrayed. You discussed about the sort of weakening indirectly of the Arab states, and I think, yes, Gurion's somehow ideology today is been happening from 1900 to today. I don't think we are talking about Kurdish-Israeli relations of the past 20, 30 years in the way maybe you are posing it. I don't think that the Kurds have been benefited so far from any particular, if you like, Kurdish-Israeli interactive relations, at least on the political level. Maybe I think even Israel was not in favor of the referendum itself when this had taken place. So we have, I think, to go back and see if we are talking about this sort of relations and if the two sides are serious to pursue such a sort of interactive, if you like, relation, how, in which terms, and how this is a win-win situation, rather than, we have in a general discourse that how Israelis support the Kurds. In the end, on the ground, nothing really is happening, and then the Kurds are left, let's say, with a stigma that they are supported, but in reality, they have no support from no one. So I think this is something that needs to be sort of like considered seriously, especially, for example, when we are talking about the Kurds in Iraq, when we are talking about constitutional entity, that it needs to meet a certain sort of standard of of relations, rather than, if it would be a clandestine sort of like movement. About the case of Turkey, it's interesting what you are saying, because I was reading possibly maybe today that there is a senior Kurdish leadership who is opening to Israel ties. I think it's called Zubair Aidar. I'm not sure if he's from KCK. And he was basically talking about how this sort of opening to Israel and reviving relations with Israel might work in the favor of the Kurdish policies in the case of Turkey. Many things can be said, but on the grounds, then it's true, maybe in the 1970s, for example, there might have been an influence of Israeli policies on Kurdistan, but concretely, as an outcome, I have not really witnessed any sort of like policies that they have benefited the Kurds to a great extent. So maybe it is sort of a topic that it needs to be, and maybe also from the Israeli side, there is also this sort of different maybe scholars, this sort of understanding that maybe the Kurds would not like to be seen as having such sort of relations because of the regional sort of situation with the Arabs and so forth. But that would be, I think, even I think a hypocrisy to be stated in 2024 when the non-Arab states in the Middle East are leading right now the course of events, and not now, since 2011 and the outbreak of the Syrian crisis. So the point, I think, is, and it's not only about the Kurds and the Israelis. I think it's the degree of sort of decisiveness as to what sort of policies do we need to exert, and in the end, how really determined we are to do so, because we have seen that determination has played a critical role in the course of events in the Middle East, starting from Obama in Syria back in 2015, which, okay, had his own sort of restrictions because of the Russian and Chinese veto, but still, this is A. And B, more recently, I think the Gaza war revealed, after such a long period of time, after 2017, with the crisis between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that somehow Saudi Arabia withdrew, how really, I think from the first time, Israel is confronting Iran, and this apparently, it seems to have outcomes, because Iran is not sending missiles, I mean, to irrelevant parts. Iran is trying to show goodwill, but in its own way, going through the back door, which is called Kurdistan, because obviously they feel more affiliated to them than to any other sort of pure Western camp. And I think the war in Gaza really, I mean, somehow, in terms of impact, it has its own importance in the same way that the Syrian crisis had, but definitely is bringing, I think, again into the forefront the real problems in the Middle East, because now we don't have an indirect, as I said in my sort of talk, but a direct, really, confrontation of those players that they always had the same problems, but they were able, to sort of like undermine them and play them either through sort of the Palestinian issue or through B, C, and D. So now it's very important, I think, that we are talking about the real problems, and that the main actors, for good or for bad, are directly involved, because otherwise, if we keep having indirect conflicts, I'm not sure the extent to which this resolution that we are, requesting could ever happen. So it's challenging, and maybe, okay, therefore, so the forthcoming years will be more sort of formative in terms of, the outcomes that, we now discuss that might take place or not.
Thank you. And it's very interesting what you're saying, because if indeed, with regards to the Kurds of Turkey and Israel, if indeed they are starting to develop relations, maybe it's the first time that Israel is starting to really turn around on Turkey, because Israel was always trying to keep relations with Turkey, however bad they were always trying to keep an open door. If they're trying to really develop relations with Turkish Kurds, or maybe we're going to see some interesting things in the future.
Well, I think, Turkey as a country will always be important, maybe for everyone. Yeah. But I think now what you just mentioned, it's something that Turkey has been doing. Turkey can have parallel relations, and creating the discourse that there is no problem with that as well. So why not Israel or whoever else who could not do the same? There is no any restriction.
Yeah, but Turkey is always of two minds towards Israel. That's always, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, if Turkey is the criterion, of the formulation of the regional politics, okay. But if not, okay, it's one more player.
Thank you, Zakia.
Don't monopolize the conversation. I have my questions too. I've been waiting patiently. I also want to thank you again for your amazing lecture. My question is about foreign policy, and I dare say so. I'm one of the advocates that that does believe that there is foreign policy of non-state actors, state-like actors, as I call them, especially in the Middle East. And I would like you to give us your opinion on the developments of the recent developments of KRG in terms of its foreign policy and cultivating relations, because I mean the KRG knows very well that the US, I mean, they have this relationship, it is institutionalized, as you very well put, It is there also with other Western countries. However, the Western retreat, and I'm not saying it in an exaggerating way. I mean, the fact that they're not meaning to stay and get involved in the region as they used to. This leaves a certain gap or a certain vacuum for the Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds specifically. So we've seen them trying to develop relations right, left in the Middle East, and we see them already having their own sphere of diplomacy. Right, we know that most of the embassies, they have the Iraqi embassy. Allegedly, they would have also a Kurdish delegations, but the Kurdish embassy or office is always elsewhere. Now, do we see any movement? I mean, after the I'm not going to say right after the referendum, because probably was down low, but especially after 2020, when it was quite clear that the US was retreating. Do we see any substantial movements from KRG to establish stronger relationships, especially with the Gulf? That is one question. And the second question has to do with the domestic situation. How do you evaluate? I mean, there's a stagnation, one may say, but the grief, let's put it this way, between the brothers in KRG is still there. Do you think this is just gonna stay like this because it's like, tradition, or do you think it's gonna resolve, or do you think it's gonna clash at some point? If you could give us like an overview on both the domestic situation and the foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Okay, so these are 5, 6, 10 questions in one. Let me just try and respond. So very briefly, because I want to reflect more on your last point, with regards to the Gulf. Back in 2015, I wrote an article on the GCC and Kurdish politics. I think that we can safely say that we can talk. I mean, the KRG. The KRG UAE model, I think it is a working model of relations. So far, I think we could safely say that, the KRG has developed in different sort of lenses relations with the UAE. With the rest of the Gulf countries, there is sort of a level, obviously, of, of interaction, but I don't think it is at a point where there is necessarily and directly mutual interest. I mean, Saudi Arabia would care more about the role of the Arabs, the future of Kirkuk, through the sort of Arabs and the Arab lenses or Mosul, rather than, how KRG could be developed and how they could basically engage within that. I'm skeptical. But yeah, with the UAE, I think the relations at all levels, I think, could be considered as a working model. With regards to the domestic, I would say that I think the current attempt that, of course, it was started before the rise of ISIS, but then it was intensified further after. It's the only, I think, resolution of the domestic sort of conflict to an extent. I'm talking about the process for the institutionalization of the Kurdish army, of the Peshmerga. So right now there is a process of unification, but it has a specific timeline, and what is basically is trying to do is to bring all the different brigades of the army under the Ministry of Peshmerga. And I think that by itself would mean that, whereas until now we had, apart from, the sort of regular sort of, apart from specific, let's say, brigades, we had most, if you like, of the sort of Peshmerga are found under the units 70 and 80, which belong to each of the sort of two Kurdish parties, the KDP and the PUK in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So I think if this unification process can be concluded, it will happen. This would mean that we would talk about an institutionalized army. This would mean that maybe parties in this case would have less leverage in order to play all these different political differences, and then maybe the political differences will stay as they are. It's happening in any sort of context in Greece here or there. I think the element of the fact that me as a party have my own army was, I guess, the critical point and the difference. So I think if the unification process can be completed successfully, and this is something which, of course, is being supported by the coalition, US, France, Germany, Netherlands, and so forth, that they are taking part in the training of the Peshmerga, in sort of they're actively sort of present. They're contributing this to happen, and can talk about a unified armed force. I think this is something which can solve to a great extent the current sort of problem. This was, I mean, what happened in the night of Kirkuk back on 16th of October 2017, it was pretty much related to the fact that you had this sort of dipole structure. So if this is not there, I guess the political differences will stay on the table rather than, using other means in order to achieve certain goals. We will see how realistic in practice can be that. However, the sides right now, they're somehow optimistic. There are pressures from neighbors in order this process not to go ahead. But I think that this is something that, by 2026, it would have been, let's say, determined whether it's possible to happen or not. Now, about the foreign policy element, unfortunately, I am those that have not deconstructed but informed, I hope constructively, the discipline through the case study before with the US and the Kurds, where I try to prove that we can have institutionalized relations between a state and non-state entity, at least of this non-state type that I describe the states to be, which we can discuss in a different sort of talk. But even further, last year, we tried to create sort of a book in order to be able, based on this typology, to prove that foreign policy agents, can be non-state actors, apart from these states to be like, for example, the KRG or the PLO, but institutions as well. We talk about, for example, the European Union. We are talking about, the EU as a sort of a foreign policy actor, at least on the go, and many other examples. So in this case, I think, and this is what I was arguing in this book, that I think it's the time that we need to understand and explore, I think, this role of the non-state actorhood in the foreign policy making. And I think the only way that we can develop this novel understanding of the foreign policy and its ontology, because the problem is ontological, I think, is through the prism of the foreign policy as an end product, that it needs to be perceived differently. I have provided a definition in my book, where I try to see foreign policy as responses to the activities of actors perceived as external, state or non-state, in the domestic, regional, international realm, and may be exercised by state or non-state entities. This is the definition that I have given. And I think, these all different regional examples, like, the Middle East, and within there, more specifically, the Palestinians, the Kurds, they have given us really the tools through which we are able to, if you like, revise the theory, and, to be able and somehow keep a balance and, a sort of real link between what is theory and what is practice, because sometimes it's not given that the theory is portraying what is happening on the grounds, but equally what is happening on the grounds, it has many times been failed to sort of inform the theory, because unfortunately we like to be sort of drawn by stereotypes and traditional sort of views of norms and terms that they are subject to change, because what we are doing is not static, is changing. So yeah, everything is a constant effort. Thank you.
I agree. I was waiting for that book to come out. As I told you before, it was directly related to my PhD, but it wasn't out in time. I have a similar definition, but I totally agree. I'm telling you, it was. I think it's one of the most important contributions in the recent developments in the Middle East, especially in terms of foreign policy that in itself affects the dynamics of the region, and by extension, the way we perceive, IR does not have to be a deathbed for in the middle. It's the opposite. The Middle East doesn't have to be a deathbed for IR anymore. There are enough intellectuals to keep it going. We thank you very much. I think we're on the hour's mark. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your for answering our questions in the lecture. We hope to see you at some point in one of our live events. It was an honor and a pleasure, and I hope we stay in touch.
Thank you so
Stavros,
much.
is there something you'd like to say?
I would like to thank you as well, and to urge everyone to rewatch the lecture tomorrow on YouTube and to follow us on YouTube, subscribe, notification, and all that good stuff.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Marianna, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture, and we hope that you'll join us in next events, and also here in Greece, perhaps.
Sure.
To give us a
Anytime.
brief to give a brief to CEMMIS for what is happening in the Middle East, and particularly for your new book on Iran and the region.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it as well. Thanks.
All the best. Bye-bye.